Something I think will be fascinating, Chantal, is to see, as each of the different classes of technology have their own AI ingredients, how do the firms seek to bring that together, and how do they decide what they're going to prioritize for adoption over the other elements which might remain sort of latent within some of the tools that they already have in house. So I think this is going to be fascinating in terms of the push me, pull me elements of AI adoption.
Welcome to the People in Legal podcast. This is the Law and Beyond show. I'm your host, Chantal McNaught. Today's conversation is supported by Durham. Carl Olson from Durham is today's featured guest, and we retain full editorial control and aim to provide a balanced, informative and engaging conversation with Carl. Carl began his career like many of us in legal tech. He was a lawyer before transitioning into legal publishing. Now Carl leverages his almost 40 years in delivering information and software solutions to the legal and professional services sectors as the Managing Director for the Asia Pacific region of Durham. Carl has recently focused extensively on the transformative potential of generative AI within the legal and professional services landscape. We have Carl in the hot seat today to talk about the Changing Legal Landscape report published in partnership with the Australasian Law Practice Managers Association. That's ALPMA. Thank you for joining us on the show, Carl.
Thanks, Chantal. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, fabulous. We're just having a great chat before we press the record button. For listeners who haven't read the report, and as a PhD researcher, I'm very much in tune with how important these sorts of reports that get published are, particularly around the trends on how law firms are dealing with the changing landscape in how they do law as a business. What is the Changing Legal Landscape study, and why did Durham partner with ALPMA on it, Carl?
Look, first thing is we've been working with ALPMA since 2015, but the report itself, we collaborated on that from 2019. I think law firms have always been interested in getting stats, but we'll talk a little later on, Chantal, about just how much change there is. And I think at the moment, criticality of benchmarking and really being able to explore the underlying drivers, not only of business performance, but the other things that are important for law firms to know, in particular around people, around how they're acquiring business, retaining clients, all those sorts of things. It's never been more important. And I think being able to provide that information to them is something that we feel is a really important thing to be part of.
Absolutely. It does provide not only for the law firms to be able to get an overview about the trends of what they're seeing, because I think a big part of it is like, oh, we are alone in this, and what challenges, what others are investing in or thinking about. But I think it also provides important context for other sorts of support that those around law firms, like this expanding legal universe that we talk about on the show. So that's fantastic. And I understand that Durham had surveyed 181 firms across Australia and New Zealand, with also a small percentage that operate in Singapore. That's a fairly decent turnout rate, given that it was only a couple of months that the survey was available, I was reading. What was the most surprising trend for you? Because I know for me, it was the steady increase in the Wellbeing initiatives. There was, 13% from in 2022, and now up to 45%. Almost half of respondents this year have indicated that wellbeing initiatives are important.
Look, every time I talk about the report, the first thing I do is thank the people who responded. I think we've all been asked to participate in surveys, and it takes a reasonable amount of time to do so. So you're right. I think the fact that we had 181 responses is really good. And those responses were across Australia, New Zealand, and also Singapore. I think you're right to pick up on the wellbeing point, but I think there were some really interesting stats about that. There were interesting stats about AI adoption, and we're certainly going to talk about that a little bit more.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just talking about wellbeing, I think there's a lot of talk. I still think that we're in a words rather than actions phase with the legal sector. They might be a little bit contentious, but I have a lot of conversations with law firms on this topic. And being working with an association with ALPMA, means that we're not only dealing with, traditional law firm leaders, managing partners and the like, but we're talking about other people who are practice managers or perhaps functional leads within the firms. And I think they all provide a different perspective. Still words rather than actions, but I think the industry's come along a long way. And I think that stat, the growth from 13 to 45, is really key to the fact that there's very serious intent being shown, and we'll see changes moving forward.
Great. Cole, let's zoom in on that topic around generative AI, because you shared with me that 90% of practitioners in the survey had tried AI, and that you made the comment about being so close to 100% adoption with governance and IT provisioning not having kept pace. Can you expand a little bit about that?
I think about the term inflection point, and I think it's been used a number of times over the years. We've certainly used it in relation to the internet, but I remember being a very junior lawyer and being introduced to desktop word processing. Sure, I was dictating, but I got to use computers to do that. The move into natural language text processing, even things like hybrid working, these are all potentially inflection points. And perhaps we use the term too readily. But they're important because they impact firms in terms of the division of labour, how firms resource key functions, what they can do to transform their cost base, and really reshape legal service delivery. But I think that all pales around what Gen AI will mean for the industry moving forward. I wanted to reflect on a couple of recollections I have around the launch of Gen AI, which was in, I think, November 2022. And I remember being asked by a client in December 2022 what this meant for the business I was working for. I'll call out that business. It was Thomson Reuters. And the question was, what was that going to mean? To be honest with you, at the time, I had no idea at all. And I had to ask around internally to try and get a perspective on that. By the next year, I attended a senior leadership conference. And to illustrate the pace of change, the conference was almost entirely about what that business was going to do to respond to what was perceived to be an existential threat, but also potentially a great source of opportunity. And I think that's probably how the legal industry in the whole is seeing it. I was thinking a bit about Gen AI more broadly, and I think one thing I thought was fascinating was in August 2023, Gartner placed generative AI at the peak of inflated expectations on its hyper cycle of emerging technologies. And Gartner did that because of the 3 to 5 year potential for Gen AI to transform not just the legal sector, but everything we know. And they cited the viral adoption of Gen AI tooling and emergent ecosystems. And I think we're seeing those things occur, perhaps not at the pace that Gartner originally contemplated. But let's go back to the stats. And you've called out some of them already. The survey we did, first of all, another data point, not from the survey, but which I think is important. 76% of corporate legal teams are significantly increasing AI budgets and using technology for an expanding number of tasks. Now, if law firms are not thinking about that stat, they should be, because what that points to is self-help capability. You called out the 90% stat. That's 90% of practitioners in the survey had tried AI. The critical point there is that was up from 69% the year before. So we've seen accelerated adoption amongst what I would probably characterize as the naysayers. The important stat, I think, to your earlier comment around governance is that only 64% of firms in the survey had sanctioned specific tools or had clear policies, which means a sizable number, I think it's 26%, are using the technology without there being any specifically sanctioned tools. They're using publicly available tools. So 100% adoption, but that governance and IT provisioning is not really kept pace with it.
And
just one other quick thing,
Yep.
Chantal, and I think this is another really fascinating point from my perspective. Traditionally, if you'd had people characterize the legal sector, they'd probably describe it as reasonably slow and low in terms of adoption of technology and change. But what was fascinating was that 70% of lawyers reported regular use of generative AI, and the comparative number that we had for the wider survey population was 44%. So that's other sectors. So I think it's pretty impressive, and it talks to the fact that the legal sector might have been a little later to switch on, but things are really happening incredibly quickly now. I cut you off. What were you going to ask me?
That's all right, because now there's a couple of things in there, and I think up to that point where, so am I understanding correctly that lawyers have a higher adoption in this survey than the general working sectors? So that's really big, because that goes to the heart of this claim that lawyers are traditionally slow movers, really difficult. You have to, drag them along. They're always behind. Kind of bucks that, doesn't it? And have you, in your experience, have you seen that actually there's quite a lot of instances of lawyers adopting technology?
Lawyers being lawyers, they've wanted to really satisfy themselves that the investment in the technology and the change warranted the effort. Why change when things are working well using established processes? So I think we've got to that point where there's a broader acceptance that technology needs to be used. But I think something that's interesting about the stat as well is it probably talks to what lawyers do and the potential for AI to be impactful in their daily
Hmm.
lives. So lawyers do a lot of incredibly sophisticated and complex things, but they're doing a lot of document processing, for example, and that's something that AI is incredibly good at. Just to use one example, and lawyers have been turning to technology to do discovery and other tasks for a long time. So this is just a continued trending of what we've seen historically. But I think this, in my mind at least, is probably a key factor around that level of adoption.
I think that goes to show the, well, one, you have all that experience as well, having seen all the trends within the legal sector, but also that whole interest that you have in that generative AI is so transformative on how lawyers do work, and we will get to more of that. The other thought I had when you were talking about how 26% are using public generative AI, which we have seen some jurisdictions outright ban. The opposite, I think, is true in was it the New York have banned all but the free version of ChatGPT, which is
Yeah,
um,
isn't that fascinating? I read that as well. I mean, I haven't done enough reading on the topic to know what motivated that, but I think we're going through different phases as well as peak bodies, and the government seeks to take a stance around what constitutes safe practices and unsafe practices, and you know, we. I think we're going to talk about cybersecurity later, Chantal, and
yeah.
that's an important thing that perhaps we can touch on there.
That's that's exactly where I was heading. So that whole dark AI, or AI misuse, and the scary cybersecurity type stuff. So you've got some interesting insights from the report as well. Can you walk us through that?
We asked firms to talk about those things that they saw as an absolute priority, and there were a number of things in the mix, but cybersecurity was high rating. 63% of firms highlighted this as their absolute priority, and that's actually up on previous years. It's not only what the survey told us; it's the sort of conversations that we're probably all having day to day, particularly if you're talking to law firm leaders or IT heads, etc. Cybersecurity really does keep them up at night. Um,
Hmm.
and look, there are a number of reasons for that. There've been some reasonably high-profile examples of data theft. And I won't call out the firm, but in 2023 there was certainly a very landmark example for a large Australian commercial practice. And the key point there was, that it impacted a blue chip client base, corporates, government clients, etc. I think beyond what has been, well reported, there probably have been lots of other whoopsies or near whoopsies, and obviously there's an obligation to disclose, information on breaches, etc. And I'm sure that has happened, but I think there's probably been a lot of other stuff which has happened that hasn't necessarily met that threshold, but has caused leaders concern. And when thinking about cybersecurity, um, legal departments need to be undertaking risk assessments and taking actions on a broad range of different sorts of threats. And for example, the 2023 case study was a sophisticated ransomware attack. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've got unintentional and possibly low impact things, but things nonetheless that I think firms should be thinking about. For example, Recently, it was widely reported that the New South Wales Reconstruction Agency had an issue where a former contractor had uploaded 12,000 rows of data, and that included personally identifiable information. It was loaded up into ChatGPT, which is interesting given your earlier point about New York. And what I've come to understand is, many of these AI tools require specific consent before they can learn from prompting data and potentially surface that to other users of the application. But nonetheless, this is something which is putting into a third party's hands, highly sensitive information. So I think that's a strong call to action. And one of the things that, law firms will no doubt want to be thinking about around what their choice of tools are. The other thing I was going to say about that, Chantal, is, it's not a new thing, but law firms are increasingly called upon to provide their work product, their precedent information, other stuff through extranets so they can be accessed by clients. The client figures they're paid for the advice or for the information, and they should be able to access that moving forward. And I think that's a very positive thing. But again, it introduces new considerations around how do you harden that to make sure that you're not exposing the data and potentially the client to any risk. So, there's a heck of a lot in this, and I'm not surprised it keeps senior lawyers
Yeah.
and leaders up at night.
And I'm going to link that to the whole wellness aspect, because there's this really fantastic resource that I will link in the show notes as well, with the link to this report too. And that resource is around cyber security and, if you believe that you have been hacked, but it's mostly to do with the fact that it is an incredibly stressful thing to have happened. And sometimes when you do have an infiltration or a perceived infiltration, that you then become hyper vigilant, and that will have run-on effects as well for your mental well-being. So this checklist that was developed by a Professor Liz, I can't remember her last name, so I'll just say Professor Liz.
Professor Liz, yeah.
She is a computer software engineer based in San Francisco, and developed this checklist that I think is something that you could easily implement within a law firm as well, because of all of those things that you were saying, Carl. So that's wonderful, and loops us back around through to that whole wellness aspect. And if you've got leaders that are staying up at night because they're terrified about the consequences of their cybersecurity and keeping the lights on the next day, what are some of the trends?
Chantal, how about I talk a little bit about work-life balance, and then I can go into some of the other things as well. So I don't have the stat immediately in front of me. I'll find it a little later on. But we know that the legal industry is an industry which has high levels of stress, high levels of suicide above averages across other sectors, high levels of drug taking, alcohol overuse, etc. So we know it's incredibly stressful. So, things to ensure that work-life balance is preserved, that firms are attentive to mental health is really important. I wanted to share a couple of stats with you again from the survey. We asked the survey respondents to talk about work-life balance. There's an incredible dichotomy in terms of the responses we got. Respondents feel that more than 2/3 of legal professionals in Australia do not have a healthy work-life balance, which doesn't surprise me, but which is a fairly significant number. But in contrast, 97% of the respondents reported their own firms' employees do have a healthy work-life balance. Now, bear in mind the people responding to this tended to be pretty senior, and possibly they felt that the things that they were driving within the firm meant that their firm was different, was immune. I mean, it's cognitive bias, it's Stockholm syndrome. I'm not sure really what it is, but there's a massive discrepancy between those statistics. And we know that there is no one panacea. There's no one thing that's going to address work-life balance for people working in law firm. But there's a number of things that are really relevant. One thing that I think is kind of interesting, and just trying to sort of attach another data point to this, is the pressure associated with people having to account for their hours to drive a fixed fee model. An hourly-based charging model, rather. And the survey told us that nearly 30% of firms are offering fixed fee or alternative billing arrangements. And look, on face value, that's probably a good thing in the sense that people are perhaps relieved of some of the burden of having to punch out those really long hours. But it does place a higher premium on efficiency. And I think sometimes the trade-off around hours is replaced with the need to do more in less time. And so I've been speaking to a number of leaders about the proactive steps that they're taking to improve work-life balance. And there are examples of some really innovative practices. One that I thought was really interesting was a firm that was putting in place a really interesting way of putting in place teaming arrangements. And the basis behind the teaming arrangement was that part-time staff who still had to carry the workload and effectively be always on for clients were always going to be able to struggle to work within the part-time terms under which they're employed. Basically, they had to front up outside their rostered days of work. So these more advanced teaming arrangements put multiple people onto engagements. They make sure that systems are recording progress, that continuity is preserved, even if someone is trying to work within and in a disciplined way within a 3-day working week, for example. But on the other end of the spectrum, something I heard firms talk about proudly, and in a way it's innovative, but it probably is having the opposite benefit, if you like, and that is arrangements to allow lawyers to remain on the tools by funding out-of-hours care arrangements, so that if a parent can't go home to look after their children, a babysitter will be provisioned. And at one level, that's good. It's potentially a perk, but on the other hand, it's institutionalizing the sense that people with dependents should be always available. They should be there to work through those long engagements. And we're not going to change that. Law firms have a particular business model, but I think trying to be sensitive to some of these things and work through them in a way that really works. If you wouldn't mind me just going on with a few more kind of reference points here that I think are quite interesting. The survey certainly talked about the importance of flexible work arrangements. And whereas that's relevant across different age groups, the younger demographics were certainly highlighting this. And it's definitely something which enlightened firms should be thinking about around engagement, talent acquisition, retention, and probably productivity as well. Secondly, and not in this survey, but I've been exposed to other stats that show the availability of labor-saving technology is important. And I know that many lawyers and support staff have said that they will leave to move to a firm with better technology because they figure that that's going to enrich their lives as workers. We all know instinctively, but we know also from the studies that strong people leadership and organizational culture are really important, certainly where that reinforces people's sense of worth. That learning and development is important in the mix. But the one thing that was fascinating for me was just how potent the move to a 4-day working week was in terms of some of the responses. And I haven't really been having as many conversations about that. So I thought that was fascinating. There has been some piloting of that. I've got to be honest with you, I don't really have good data around where this has been trialed and what it looks like. But I think what's really challenging about it, and the reason I wanted to call out that teaming point before, was how does the legal services sector embrace 4-day working weeks and still meet those always-on expectations of clients, which I think, I'm sure some firms are working that stuff through, but I think that's probably the thing which is going to make it tricky. But look, the stats told us that firms are looking at this because this is something that employees and even partners are quite outspoken about.
It's a mark of a robust study, isn't it, when you end up leaving with more questions than you started with. And I think there's some really good questions in there, particularly what you highlighted around the possibility of some bias happening with the survey responses between the perception of the whole of the profession versus what's going on internally. And then when you contextualize those sorts of conversation about flexible working arrangements and AI and this whole fabled 4-day work week. And before we get into our, I guess, main course of the discussion that I'm really eager to ask, which is our conversation cards. I do have one other question for you around that whole AI piece that I think does link into those work-life balance aspects, and for you and what you've seen on the ground in multiple different countries across your extensive generative AI interest, what are the sorts of things that forward-facing law firms are really doing approaching the technology? And is there anything within the report that also reflects that?
It was a bit in the report, and whereas you're kind enough to talk about my extensive AI exposure, I mean, I'm one of many who've been very interested in this topic for quite some period of time. But I think what might be interesting is for me to posit some thoughts around what a forward-looking AI-driven sort of firm might look like and what they might be doing. I think the firms that I've seen who are doing this really well have quite a holistic AI strategy. And that's typically a strategy that's supported by law firm leaders, technologists, and the people who are the operational experts within the firm. They're working to a shared vision. It's the main course. It's not the amuse-bouche. It's not the dessert. And I think those firms have typically sized up their current client base, and they've thought about their business model and how they want to grow. And they've taken a view around what AI will mean to their clients and to their prospects. And so they've really sought to understand that. I mean, that's just good standard practice, but because this is a change, doing that I think is essential. They've probably also been transparent with their clients about how they're using AI. And one of the things that has come up many a time, you've quite possibly interviewed people on this, Chantal, is about the so-called AI dividend. If a firm is deriving efficiency from the use of AI, is that simply going to partner profit, or is that something where the clients are sharing in the spoils? And I think sophisticated firms, forward-looking firms, are probably having that dialogue with their customers, and they're reflecting that around pricing, around what's perceived within the value proposition. I think AI is probably shaping their hiring, their learning development, and their reward and recognition as well.
What I was going to say was echo what you just said about holistic, that it really isn't a one piece of the puzzle. It is that whole picture, and it's really, really exciting to see a lot of these sorts of trends, particularly what has been uncovered in this report, because what I suppose we could predict in the future is a lot of experimentation and a lot more law firms and individual lawyers going out and trying various different things and coming away and learning from it. And this is something that really hasn't happened in the legal profession, at least in, living memory. So, it's definitely an interesting place to watch and to be.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation. And look, we've already seen this happen where some of this has been driven by the firms themselves, and some of it's been driven by the vendors who are provisioning new tools and capability. I mean, something I think will be fascinating, Chantal, is to see, as each of the different classes of technology have their own AI ingredients, how do the firms seek to bring that together, and how do they decide what they're going to prioritize for adoption over the other elements which might remain sort of latent within some of the tools that they already have in house. So I think this is going to be fascinating in terms of the push me, pull me elements of AI adoption.
We're going to get into a random question here, which is, all guests do this on the Law and Beyond show. There are no exceptions here, and you can watch me terribly shuffle these cards. And this one is for you, Carl. What is your favourite song right now?
I'm certainly a bit music obsessed, and this is something that would probably require me to have a bit of a lie down and think about it for a period of time.
Bit existential for you, Carl.
Too existential. But a band that I'm very taken with, and I've seen live a few times, that may not be well known by everyone listening today, is Khruangbin. They're an Austin, Texas 3-piece band with very limited vocals, and they play sort of quite dreamy style music. I do encourage people to have a listen to that. The name, for some bizarre reason, is Thai for aeroplane, and there's an element of world music to the music, but it's fascinating. So check them out, and if there's massive Spotify downloading, I want to share the action.
That's awesome. One of the features that we could do is actually link it onto the show, which would be really cool.
Okay.
And then cheers. Thank you so much, Carl. It's so awesome having you on the show.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.